1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My name is Andreas Werner. I'm a record producer, songwriter, and owner of Crazy Chester Records. The theme song you just heard is performed by Wet Willis, Jimmy Hall, and Funky Chester. The Crazy Chester Radio Hour is a weekly music talk podcast featuring an eclectic group of guests with musical hearts, minds, and souls. And many of the episodes will dive deep into the rich history of music mecca Muscle Shoals. My guest today is my good friend and collaborator Charlie Taylor. Charlie is a songwriter who has written songs with many of the great Southern songwriters, including Dan Penn, Spooner Oldham, and Buzz Cason. He's also released 3 albums as an artist, and today we'll talk about Charlie's most interesting life in and around music. Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, my good friend Charlie Taylor. Charlie, I'm so glad to have you on my podcast. Thank you for taking the time. So good to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we're able to do this.
Thank you.
Ever since I, conceived the idea of this podcast, I knew I needed to have Charlie on it for a lot of reasons. First of all, you've been in and out of music for a long time, and you've seen so many different scenes and eras and different aspects of the music industry. And you're also an artist and have done albums in your own right. And I hope we can touch on all that a little bit.
Sure.
But maybe we can kind of go back to the beginning and just kind of ask you how you got exposed to music. What was like your earliest musical memories?
After World War II, my dad bought a Hillicrafter's shortwave radio, and as a little boy, even before I started school, 5, 6 years old, at night, and it also had a headset with it, earphones today, but I used to get on that and just start spinning the dial at night and landing on different radio stations. And I would listen to WLS in Chicago on a clear night, WHBQ in Memphis. And I grew up in a town, Mayfield, Kentucky, although I was born in Abilene, Texas. But and I began to get a sense of rhythm and blues. My mother was a big band advocate, and she was a great piano player too. So I got a dose of Glenn Miller and all the big band, Artie Shaw, all the big bands, Benny Goodman, the 40s. So between that and the blues I was picking up and the stone country music that was played on the radio in Western Kentucky, I got a real dose of a wide bandwidth of music growing up. And my dad liked Wagner and Beethoven, and so I got a little bit of that too. But I really gravitated toward country music and the blues and R&B, and it's really R&B in its kind of infancy. So those are my earliest memories of records, was big band after the war, and that was kind of the beginning. And I knew I loved music. I mean, we had a baby grand piano, and I used to lay under it while my mother was playing it and just kind of get lost in all, close my eyes and just get lost in all that. So, and then try to pick out, in high school, I would try to pick out, 3 or 4 chords and in music, but, at 14 years old, we moved from Mayfield to Westport, Connecticut, and then I got a huge dollop of doo-wop. And of course, Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and Sun Records, Sam Phillips, who I came to know later, huge influence on me. And, I played in a band in college. And so it was just this slow evolution, over maybe 20 years of getting into it. And I guess somebody who really launched me forward was a guy in San Angelo, Texas that I met, High Pockets Duncan, who was Buddy Holly's manager. And he managed a radio station there, and I took him a tape of a song that I recorded in San Angelo called Oliver Street, and he liked it, and he said, if you want to get anywhere in the music business as a songwriter, you need to go to New York. And I'd lived there very briefly in early 1966, or LA. So I started thinking about Los Angeles because I didn't want to move back
Let
to New York.
me interrupt you here real quick, and we'll get to all of that.
Okay. Absolutely.
But in your teens in Westport, you also got very much interested in cars.
I
and
did.
You were a member of
The
the
Downshifters.
It was a Hot Rod Club, which
Right.
actor Michael Douglas was
Right.
a member of
Yeah.
as well. And can you tell me a little bit about that scene, and then maybe also a little bit how music was part of that scene as well?
Sure. We were 14, 15 years old, and before I got my driver's license, I bought a Model A, and I yanked the 4-cylinder engine out of that and found a V8 flathead Ford and put that in there, and it was a Mercury, I think. Never got it running, but I messed up our parents' garage. I had grease all over the place, but I was enthralled by the sound and fury of hot rods, and eventually bought a 38 Ford and got that running, and music played a huge, I think, part of all of our lives. I know when we get together at reunions, we talk about the evolution of music and how much lyrics meant back then, and how much of a change there is in popular music. I mean, you had on the top 40, you had Dean Martin, the Everly Brothers, Elvis Presley, Percy Faith and his orchestra. You had this huge bandwidth of music, and now it's all separated into Americana and R&B, which I don't recognize anymore. And it totally changed. But back then, everything was like put into the top 40. So there was something for everybody in there. There were no genres in music, really. And that's, we listened to a lot of Jerry Lee Lewis and Gene Vincent and Elvis and all the doo-wop groups that came out of New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, and it's the soundtrack of our lives, basically. Sit there, have a radio on, working on your car with other people, and we've been working on a script with Michael Douglas for 8 years about the Downshifters, so we're hopefully getting toward the end of that. We met with him last May in New York, and he gave us some very specific instruction about what he thought we should include in it. So that's, I guess, the short answer.
Yeah, and one thing I love about your songwriting too is that you can hear traces of all of that in it, and it's such a timeless sound because it was so good and so diverse, like you said. But earlier on, you mentioned your first band. Would you tell us a little bit about that and the kind of what you did?
Yeah, I also went to high school with a guy named Barry Tashin, who was in the Remains, who opened for the Beatles in 1966. And Barry lives here in Nashville and is still a good friend of mine. But I was in a band at Transylvania University, where I went to college, in 64 and 65. And it was, we played all the, we had a couple of originals, and then we played Ricky Nelson covers and, you name it covers. So, and we did sock hops, and, we had a little gig on a radio station in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, which is about 30 miles away. We thought we were the Beatles, so.
Tell us about the name of that band, too.
Little Hilton and the Artesians. Little Hilton, Hilton Winley, was the lead singer, so we decided to call him Little Hilton. And the Artesians, I think our drummer, Jerry Morse, who actually toured with Dick Clark's Cavalcade of Stars later, he named us the Artesians. So that's, that was the genesis of the name. There wasn't anything magical attached to it, but we had a good time.
And is that also the first time you got to see a recording studio from the inside?
We did. We recorded in some guy's garage in Lexington, and the Songwriters were from Cincinnati, and they had a hit called Easier Said Than Done by the Essex. And so we demoed 2 songs for them, Till the Mets Win the Pennant, and I can't think of the title of the other one. It'll come to me. But anyway, a slow one and a fast one. So, and the Mets eventually did win the pennant. So it took a while, like 20 years. But that's, we kind of started off. That was my first experience in a recording studio. So.
Is it also around the same time that you started writing songs?
I had, when I graduated from college, I really started thinking about writing songs. And my cousin, John Fristow, who played for Joe South and had a brief career in Atlanta on his own, kind of was a great guitar player. So he came to visit me in Connecticut, and we sat down, and I ordered a Sears Silvertone acoustic guitar, and, the strings were about an inch off the fret. But anyway, I persevered and learned some chords, and that's when I really started thinking about writing songs. And, you mow the grass and you make up lyrics that you can't remember to songs. So that's how I started, probably like a lot of songwriters. I know Dan Penn, who along with Jeff Gillette, produced my 3 records, said he started that way too. You can't remember the lyrics, so you make them up. So that's what I did.
Yeah, and earlier you mentioned a song called Oliver Street.
Right.
How did that come about, and how that whole connection with High Pocket Stunk, and how did that come about?
Well, I met High in a radio station he owned, and once he told me that he had been Buddy Holly's manager, I had this tape that I just recorded. So I said, "Would you mind listening to it?" And he said, "Sure." So that was my introduction to him. And of course, that was 1968. That was 9 years after Buddy died.
That song, didn't that kind of they had a little bit of an interesting life to it?
It did. I wrote it about my wife. Actually, we were dating at the time, Susan, in Washington, and I wrote it about her. I lived on M Street, and Olive Street was the next street above us, M and 28th Street in Georgetown, and she lived over on Prospect Street in Georgetown. So anyway, I just made up the name Oliver Street, and I took that song to England in 1969, and I visited Apple Studios at 3 Savile Row, and I walked in off the street, and I told them, I live in Dallas, Texas, and or Houston at the time, and I'm a songwriter. And they said, "Well, what have you got?" And I gave him the mono tape of Oliver Street, and he played it, and he said, "That's a good song." He said, "We'd like to sign you to a one song contract." So I left there with a 1-song contract at Nimpor House, which was the Beatles publishing company. And so it never got recorded, but it was an interesting turn with that song. It kind of opened a door, and it also kind of validates you as a songwriter too. So to have, people like that. And that was a pretty heady time to be in London too, because the Beatles were, little did anybody else know it, but they were on their last legs, as a band. But it sort of validated me as a songwriter. So, I just made up my mind that I was going to pursue it. It took me another 2 or 3 years to really screw up the courage to move to Los Angeles, but I finally did that. And
but that song Oliver Street got recorded still, not through Apple. But can you tell us a little bit about that recording?
The studio was Joe somebody, I forget his name, but he ran a music store, and he played keyboards, and he had a guitar player who taught guitar lessons at the guitar studio. So he had a studio in his house, and he actually cut a couple of bands that Sonny and the Sunliners, who had they had a couple of really big regional hits. They're kind of a Tex-Mex band, but they also kind of did a little R&B in there too. So he cut them, and it was a session lasted about an hour, I guess, and my job was just sing the song because they were the background. And I think he had a very, I don't know if there's a drum machine on there or not. I can't remember, but that was the genesis of the song. And then it actually, when I got released from that contract with Apple, I took it to Major Bill Smith in Fort Worth, Texas, who actually Delbert McClinton was signed to him.
Hey
and
Baby,
Bruce Chanel, and he wanted it, so I gave it to him, but nothing ever happened to it. He was going to take it to Shelby Singleton, and I don't know what nothing ever came of it. But again, he thought it was worth pursuing, so that just kind of made me even more determined to explore music full time in Los Angeles. So it was kind of the thing that it was kind of the force that moved me forward. That one song, I never thought about it that way, but you're right.
Yeah, and didn't somebody, was his name Dave Diamond or something?
David Diamond cut a song of ours called Hobo John, which was a song that I had originally written that got rewritten with a guy and his wife in L.A. And that was released in 1976, right as I was leaving Los Angeles, and that got some airplay on country stations. He was a big disc jockey in L.A. He just died last year in Minnesota, where he was from, but that got some airplay around the country, and so it is what it is. Still got the single.
But before you moved to California, you also met an artist by the name of Robin Reynolds.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about that.
Robin was there was an Air Force base called Goodfella Air Force Base in San Angelo. It was a kind of a secret intelligence base where they decoded messages. And this is at the height of the Vietnam War. And Robin, I met him in a club. He played really great bossa nova guitar, and he was a great songwriter. He's from Arkansas. And I've tried many times to get in touch with him, but I've never been able to. But anyway, I met him in a club, and I took him into Joe's studio where I'd done my little record and recorded, I don't know, 4 sides on him or something like that. And I love the songs still. I think they're commercial, and but who knew? This guy's playing in a club, and I was just taken by him. He was great, real good guitar player, real good performer, and he certainly had the bossa nova idiom down. So, and I love bossa nova music, so I said, "What the hell? I'll take him in the studio and record him."
Yeah, and not too long after that, you decided you will move to Los Angeles.
Yeah, I went from San Angelo to Houston, and from Houston to Dallas, and I spent a year there. And then at that point, Susan and I decided to get married and go to L.A., and we landed in Malibu at John Phillips' manager's house, Bill and Judy Cleary, who were dear friends of ours. So we spent a month in Malibu, got married there, and set up housekeeping in Santa Monica. But Bill introduced me to a guy named Paul Surratt, who John Phillips had cut a couple of sides on up at his studio in Bel Air. And Paul also knew Graham Parsons. So I met Graham through Paul. Paul put a band together, and it took them 5 years, but they finally got a 1-album deal with 20th Century. And this, out of who the marketing people named them Rockville Junction, and I don't think the album sold 5 copies. I mean, it just stiffed, because I don't think they promoted it. But anyway, all through that 6 or 6.5 years in L.A., I met a guy named Al Cascia at UCLA, who really was one of my mentors, and he won 2 Academy Awards for the Poseidon Adventure and for the Towering Inferno. And Al took an interest in me, and he put me in a songwriting class, and then he invited me to an advanced songwriting class. And I was working at the Burbank Studios, I think, and my wife had a job with at Columbia Studios with Lloyd Bridges. She worked for him. So Al taught me a lot, and I wrote a lot with guys. I went in the studio a lot, hung out with guys that were in the Byrds, Kevin Kelly and some of those guys, and Graham a little bit, and the Animals, guys that played in the Animals, Hilton Valentine, Andy Summers, who went on to be in the Police. And so they were friends that I saw. Mick Wilshire, who was in the new vaudeville band, they had a big hit called Winchester Cathedral. So I hung out with a lot of these guys, and I learned a lot, and I would write songs and play them for them, and they would say, well, we're playing out at the Sundance Saloon or something. Why don't you come out? We'll back you up, and, you can do some of your songs, because we like them. So I had I had some pretty good backup going on a lot of the time. So anyway, that was kind of my LA experience.
Yeah.
It was fun. I learned a lot.
Would you mind sharing a little bit of kind of the scene, around LA and at that time when you got there? Who were some of the venues and some of the bands that were
Sure.
playing there?
Well, there was the Corral in Topanga, and then there was the Sundance Saloon, and all kinds of people came to the Sundance, especially on weekends. But after the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, John Hartford would come out there and just play, and there were remnants of the Byrds and the Animals, and they would get up and play. And it was a Three Dog Night. When I moved there, they'd had a couple of hits, and they were just taking off. I actually got interviewed as their road manager, but I had to say no when they asked me if I would cart drugs around for the band. I said, I'm not interested. So, and the guy that actually took that job got arrested. So, God, there were, Three Dog Night, the Grassroots. I was signed to ABC as a songwriter with Mandy Martin, and I'll tell you an interesting story. Sneaky Pete Klein, who was a steel player in the Burrito Brothers, and I knew all those guys. I met Chris Etheridge at John Phillips' house doing some sessions. So Pete and I were in the studio he did steel overdubs, and it sounds like the London Symphony Orchestra. on a couple of things, and he played straight steel guitar on a couple of things. But it was the evening that we found out that Graham Parsons had died in Joshua Tree, the Joshua Inn out in Joshua Tree, California. And the next morning, about 11 o'clock, we were breaking up and coming down the stairs, and I saw Terry Cashman, who was Jim Croce's producer, came down the stairs as white as a sheet. And I said, what's wrong, Terry? And he said, Jim Croce just went down in an airplane crash in Nacogdoches, Louisiana. And I mean, we were both, Pete and I were both just like stunned into silence. But having met AJ and shared that story with him, it's amazing, because he was, I think, 2 years old at the time, and I'm sure he barely, if he remembers anything about his dad, he barely remembers him. So, and now he's on to greater things. Dan Penn just produced a great album on him. So if you get a chance to buy it, snap it up, because it's, I think, 12 on the charts as we speak today. So, I'm kind of going all over the place here, but I had a good time, full experience in California. I had too good a time. So I was running with a pretty fast crowd. I met the Eagles when they were Linda Ronstadt's backup band, but right after they'd recorded their first album, but before it had been released. They were all out at the Palomino Club, and I saw Linda. In fact, I used her band on these demos that we were talking about. Sneaky Pete was in that band, and I met Spooner Oldham that night, standing up. He was playing piano for her. And the meeting that almost didn't happen, Spooner was late, and he walked up to the back, and the bouncer didn't want to let him in. And he said, well, tell Linda I was here. And all of a sudden, somebody, I guess through the thing, saw him and ran out in the parking lot and brought him back in. But I wouldn't have met him were it not for her manager running out in the parking lot and getting him out of his car.
Yeah, we'll talk some
Sure.
more about Spooner and Dan
Okay,
here in a minute.
yeah.
But you just mentioned the Palomino.
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind just maybe telling a little more about that scene?
It was a great time to be in California. I used to go out there and do talent night with a couple of friends of mine, Greg Leroy and Judd Huss, and his brother. And it was crazy. And the Troubadour was another club I played in actually once as a part of a band. And all those places, I mean, you could go in those places at night and see just about anybody. And the Sundance was another place. Eric Burden used to hang out there. Who's the steel player? He had his name, Buddy Emmons used to be at the Sundance all the time. The Everly brothers, one or both of them would come out there. I met Phil Everly at the Palomino Club sitting at the bar the same night I met Spooner, and we were just sitting there talking, just like we're talking. And somebody else was there, I can't remember, but it was pretty wide open. I mean, it was an incredible time to be in LA. You could still drive around just about any time of the day or night, and now it's a traffic jam, but it was fun. I mean, it was, and people you knew. We shared a rehearsal space with Jackson Browne. So I met guys that were in White Trash, Edgar Winter's band, and we jammed together. I mean, there were jams going on all the time. I met Paul Rothschild, who came out in fact, we split a bottle of Liebfrau milk sitting on the ground listening to this band I was helping manage. And he came out and listened to them, and we must have talked for an hour and a half, and I played him a couple of songs after the band, had kind of taken a break, and he liked them, and that was just about around the time that he was cutting Pearl, which happened to be Janis Joplin's last record. And never forget, he was
Spooner Oldham connection there too.
Spooner Oldham was probably the last person to ever see her alive. she said, "Why don't you come back to the hotel with me or the motel where she was staying?" And he said, "No, I've got to be out in La Crescenta with my family." And so the next morning he gets up and gets a phone call that she's passed, you know. So, but I didn't see Spooner until, 78 or 9 after that. So that was about 5 years later or 6 years later. In Atlanta, he came with Eddie Hinton playing with him,
and we'll talk about that just in a minute. What was the name of the band you were helping manage that you just mentioned?
Well, they first they were called Ankh, which is the Egyptian sign for woman, and then they were eventually on 20th Century called Rockville Junction, which I thought was a horrible name for a band. I guess it was Brownsville Station had a popular song, so they decided to, you know, morph that name. But and they were good musicians. But as many people know in this business, you know, not even one hit wonders. But they did get an album out, and the record company didn't promote it. So you know, that's life. As we know it.
Let me ask you about a few more of your contemporaries out there. One of them is Kevin Kelly, who was a short-time drummer for the Byrds, and he was also a member of Rising Suns, Taj Mahal, and Ry Cooder's early band.
That's right.
How did you get to meet him, and tell me a little bit about him?
I don't remember exactly how I got to meet Kevin. I just know I went over to his house that he was renting, and he had a little rehearsal space there, and I looked at his drum kit, which was in a case, and I saw Rising Suns with a line through it, and then I saw the Byrds with a line through it, and I went, wow. And Kevin was quite a guy. He's the focus in Volume 2 of Requiem for the Timeless, now that Johnny Rogan wrote. And I was quoted a little bit in the first book, but a lot more in the chapter on Kevin in the Volume 2 book. But Kevin was...
and that is a book that talks about the history of the Byrds.
The Byrds, and the Volume 2 is actually the Byrds that have died. So you got Mike Clark and, you know, all the guys that have passed on, Skip Batten, and met them all actually at one point or another. But there's a chapter on Kevin, and Johnny called me probably 10 or 12 years ago, and nobody knew anything about Kevin. And Kevin and I wrote together, we recorded together, we played live together. And he was an Irishman. His dad was with Patton during World War II. He was an attorney. He was Ozzie and Harriet's attorney. His mother and father divorced when he was about 6 years old, which is a tough. And he's also Chris Hillman's first cousin. The mothers were sisters. So Chris is the one that got him into the Burrito Brothers. Chris is the one that got him into the Byrds when Mike Clark left. And he was the first person to go into the Byrds who wasn't an original Byrd. And he was there 18 months. And Graham joined a few months after. And
they recorded one of his songs on Sweethearts of the Road.
They did. They came to Nashville and Columbia Records and in the Quonset hut, and they cut Sweethearts of the Rodeo, and which has turned out to be an apocryphal record. At the time, it didn't sell a lot, but it was really kind of the first. It was before the Eagles or anybody, so really the first country rock record, if you want to say that, that hybrid. And they had a lot of guests on there who were wonderful too. So Kevin was really a part of all that. And, as the Byrds progressed, and as I'm thinking about the guitar player, his brother Roland, Clarence White. Thank you. When Clarence came, he I think he wanted to put a different spin on it. Now I can't say this with certainty, but I think he kind of edged Kevin out because Kevin had very specific ideas, and he wasn't afraid to put them out there. And I think he had maybe the little conflict with Clarence, so he got edged out of the Byrds, and he played in a group though called Gas, Food, and Lodging, which had Bill Plummer, who wound up on Exile on Main Street playing the upright bass for the Rolling Stones, and the Lynn Blessing, who was a jazz vibes player, and these guys could play anything. Mark McClure and Kevin, and Artie Johnson, who's a great guitar player. So those guys never really got an album deal. We've got some actually tracks with them, but that you've archived. But great band, a great live band. And so anyway, Kevin he never capitalized on being a Byrd. He never put himself out there, ex-Byrd, Kevin Kelly, this, that, and the other. He just let it go. And, he had a sad life, and he drifted into drugs and alcohol, and I talked to him a few weeks before he died, and I offered him a plane ticket to Nashville. We were getting ready to go in the studio, my first record at Dan's, and I think we both realized he wasn't in any shape to do it, but he died shortly thereafter, and very, very sad, actually. So, but he was a hell of a guy, and he was a hell of a musician and a great drummer. And he played with Phil Oakes at Carnegie Hall. He's on that record where Phil's in a gold lame Elvis getup, and that was so Kevin. Kevin made the rounds. I mean, everybody liked him, and he and Jeff and Alex Dumhovsky all lived together at 4450 Coldbath Avenue in Sherman Oaks, in the band house. And he was very generous with me, I'll say. And we wrote a couple of songs that who did Buzz work for out in California? He produced Nancy Sinatra.
Snuff Garrett.
Snuff Garrett. They're his property. So we recorded a couple of demos and publishing demos for them. And but he's a sweet guy. I loved Kevin. And there's a picture of Kevin holding our daughter Simone, who's about 3 years old, in this new volume too. So I just mailed her a copy of it.
Yeah, I'm glad his story is chronicled in this book.
Yeah, and I turned Johnny Rogan on to Jeff Gillette and Shannon O'Neill and Gus Duffy and all these peripheral people who knew Kevin. And I gave him their phone numbers and email addresses, and he got in touch with them. So through all of us, there's a much better picture of Kevin, of course, beyond the Byrds and
Rising
Taj
Sun.
Mahal and the Rising Suns, yeah. So
Another group of people you were around are the Curtis brothers.
yeah, Rick and Mike and Tom. Great. I've got their sister singing on a demo called No Easy Way Out, and they're great songwriters, and they had a hit. They had the flip side of Helen Reddy's huge hit. It's called Don't Mess with a Woman. They wrote that, and they lived in New York for a while and got to know Tiny Tim. This was in the late 60s. And Helen Reddy. And Helen Reddy's hit. And then they had a huge hit with Southern Cross. Stephen Stills liked a song that they had written. And there are two versions of that. There's the Curtis Brothers' first version, and then there's the version that includes the chorus. And Stephen wrote verses, turned it kind of into a sailing song. So they did really well with that. And Mike is still alive. Rick died several years ago in California, but Mike lives here in Nashville, up in Hendersonville, and he's still playing. And I think Tom lives in California, and he's still involved in the music business. He also builds guitars, I think, too. So, and the sister, Patty Moan, is still, I think, singing. I'm not sure, but very talented family.
Yeah,
And,
they put out an album as the Curtis Brothers too.
They
back
did,
in the
and it was
mid-70s.
well received. It's a great record if you can find it or download it or whatever. And they were in a band, and they were from Goshen, Indiana. They were in a band called the Visitors with a Z. But Rick and I were very good friends, and he's also a person that encouraged me a lot. He said, you got a lot of ability, and he was very helpful. So,
And that's just an interesting story because for a while they were also members of Crazy Horse.
they were with Greg Leroy and Billy Talbot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they also wrote Blue Letter. That
Blue Letter,
Mac
Fleetwood
did.
Mac had a huge hit with that. So, great songwriters, thank you. And I remember actually meeting Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks at Rick's house. They came, knocked on the door, and came in. They were collecting bottles. This was before. This was after they'd done the Buckingham Nicks record, and I guess they were out of money. I don't know. But anyway, Richard Dashett, who was the producer of Fleetwood Mac, had just gotten them all together. And I think Rick may have introduced Richard to them. But Fleetwood Mac was looking for replacements. And it just so happened they got in on Rumors, I guess it was. And, never looked back after that. I mean, and very talented, nice people too, very talented people.
Yeah. So before we move on, I would like to ask you one more question about
Sure.
your days in LA, and which is somewhat of a curiosity.
Yeah.
You kind of, and I'll have you elaborate on
Sure.
that, kind of got to collaborate with Billy Preston, which is kind of a funny story. But how did that,
Well-
what was that all about?
Jeff was recording Billy Preston at Kendon Recorders, and Billy had 3 songs that he didn't have any lyrics to, and Jeff liked my lyrics. And so he said, Billy, I've got this guy that, Charlie Taylor, who's a good lyricist. So anyway, I went to the studio, I met Billy, and, he said, here's the tape, see what you can do with it. So I took it back, and about 2 weeks later, I think there are 3 songs, and I wrote lyrics to them, took them back. About that time, he bolted L.A. with Sarita Wright, who was married to Stevie Wonder, and they ran off to New York together. I've still got we've still got the rough demos that I did and got back to him, but I never heard from him again. Bittersweet was one of the songs, and I can't think of the other 2 titles off the top of my head, but it was fun meeting him. I mean, it was I think he was pretty loaded, and he had an afro that was about 3 feet across. I mean, he had to duck to get through the door. But he was riding high, man. I mean, he'd just finished with the Beatles, and he was in big demand too. So, and he had some huge hits, really standards now, I suppose. So
Absolutely.
Nothing from Nothing, and You Are So Beautiful. And he wrote those with, I want to say a guy like Bruce Fisher or somebody.
Fisher.
Yeah, great lyricist, wonderful lyricist. So anyway, that was a kind of a glancing blow with Billy Preston, but it was fun. It was an interesting experience meeting him, and he had a great band behind him. I'll tell you that. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So
Around the same time, your first daughter Simone was born,
yeah, 73,
And-
March 16th.
and you decided to find a more stable life, I guess, to raise a family.
I did. I was drinking too much and running around with my head on fire, and I just, after trying for 6 years to be the next big thing, I realized that wasn't going to happen for me for a variety of reasons. So I thought, well, I can go. I'd already worked for the American Cancer Society, raising money for them, and successfully, I might add. And I, just made a decision and talked to my wife about it. Tried to get a publishing company off the last 8 or 9 months I was in L.A., and that was kind of a fleeting experience. So I just decided to leave, and probably one of the best decisions of my life in retrospect. I'd learned a lot about songwriting. I'm still learning a lot about it, but I just decided I didn't want to raise our daughter in L.A. It was just hectic. So we moved to Tampa, Florida, and I don't think I picked up a guitar for at least a year after I moved. It was just kind of a coming down from that LA experience, and they roll the streets up at 6 p.m. in Tampa. So it was a kind of a rough adjustment, but it was a good thing. My wife had worked in California, and so she didn't have to work then. So we had a very stable home life. And after 2 or 3 years there, we moved to Atlanta, and that's when I really fell back into the kind of songwriting. I met Bob Killen, and I met, of course, John Fristow was my first cousin, and he was at the time backing up Billy Joe Royal, and he'd had a song cut by the Atlanta rhythm section called "Join the Race to Inner Space," and he knew all those guys. And Bill Lowry, he took me around, introduced me to all these. Joe South, he played in his band. And he introduced me to all these people. And so I got the bug again, started writing, and, I haven't stopped, so.
I'm glad you haven't stopped.
Well, thank you. Well, you're obviously one of my main co-writers these days too. So that's gratifying,
It is for me, sir.
Well, it is for me too. It's fun. We've written some good songs together, and we'll write some more.
Absolutely. And a little earlier you mentioned that while living in Atlanta, I guess towards the end of the 70s, you got to reconnect with Spooner Oldham.
I did.
How did that happen?
Well, I called Spooner. I was doing a huge benefit for the American Cancer Society. I was at that point the executive director for the metropolitan unit of the American Cancer Society in Fulton County, which is the metro county for Atlanta. And one of the things that I did was when Ambassador Andrew Young Carter was president, he was the ambassador to the UN. And so we decided to do an event called Super Tennis Week in Atlanta. And the focus of the event was the tennis was kind of a peripheral thing to get a lot more people involved, but the focus was to do a full-on tribute to Andrew Young when he was the ambassador to the UN. So we got Bill Cosby to MC all this. This is before all the negative publicity on him, and we had Gladys Knight, James Brown, Jim Brown, who was a Hall of Fame football player for the Cleveland Browns, Oscar Robertson. I don't know. The dais was full of movie stars and television stars. So Jet magazine, since it was predominantly black focused event, were our sponsors. We had Kodak, we had American Airlines, and hotels and all this stuff. So it was televised. Actually, it was taped. I've never seen a copy of it, but I think Jet magazine taped it, and it was a hell of an event. And that there was something, I don't remember how many people, but it was maybe 2,000 people there. I mean, it was in the grand ballroom of the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Atlanta. It was huge. But I got to spend an afternoon with James Brown, and his manager, and that's when he was stone sober. He was a hell of a nice guy to me. I mean, I don't know what, I know he had a checkered past, but he was stone sober that day, and he came on and did a great job for us. So, I did Rick Nelson at the Fox Theater as a part of that too, and Rick and I I spent a week with him in Atlanta, so we became fast friends, and I knew him until he died.
There's another Barry Tashian connection too.
Yeah, I met him. I met Barry when he was he was her music director.
Emmylou Harris.
Emmylou Harris, thank you. Saved me again. And Phil Kaufman, I met him when he was her road manager, and he was the guy that set Graham on fire in the desert. I actually went out to Cap Rock last time I was in Joshua Tree working for Vanderbilt, and just sat there and tried to visualize what went on that night. But anyway, yeah, Barry and I met up in Atlanta and rekindled our friendship. And I think he had just moved to Atlanta to Nashville at that point. He lived in Thousand Oaks when I was in California, but I think he moved to Nashville somewhere 85 or something like that, or maybe even before that. So he was her band leader for 10 years on the road, and recorded with her. Worked with Albert Lee, who I also knew at the Sundance Saloon in California when he was with Head, Hands, and Feet. So there were all these British guys that had either mustered out of a band or were looking for something else to do, that were hanging out in Los Angeles at that point, and when we lived in California. And boy, it was a rich environment. I mean, they were always out at the Sundance Saloon in one configuration or another. So, yeah, Barry, in fact, I saw him, he came through Lexington, where we live now, Kentucky, about 3 weeks ago. They went up to a bluegrass, they taught a workshop up in West Virginia, and we had lunch together. So I'm trying to get him on
Wood Songs,
Old Time Radio Hour, Michael Jonathan's program at the Lyric Theater in Lexington. Hopefully that'll pan out. So
yeah,
we'll see. Anyway.
So you talked about those benefits, which you continued to do in many of those, also
Right.
up here in Nashville.
Yeah.
And but where we got started was you reconnecting with Spooner Oldham. So he came to Atlanta. Can you just...
He came to Atlanta with
Eddie Hinton.
Eddie Hinton, thanks again. And they were playing in Little 5 Points in a club. And I bet there weren't 5 people in that club. And it was cold as blue blazes. It was in the middle of the winter. And I had invited Spooner to a cocktail party to actually meet Gladys Knight. And he came. And, I introduced him and everything. And certainly told her about his songwriting and Dan and all that stuff. So, excuse me, I went to this little club, and here's Eddie Hinton, and he's sober as a judge, and he's singing his tail off, and Spooner's playing with him, and I think they had a drummer, and I'm not even sure there was a bass player. It was like the 3 of them, and man, Eddie was like marching in place, singing and playing guitar. He blew my head off. I mean, he was amazing that night, and there was almost nobody there. And I remember going out to the car, and Roxanne was a baby, a little baby.
Spooner's daughter.
Yeah, and Spooner's wife, Karen, they were in the car, and I said, God, you're going to freeze. You need to come inside. But that was my introduction it's the only time I ever met Eddie, but he was nice. He had jalapeno peppers. He was offering everybody a jalapeno pepper. So whatever it was, he was on fire that night. I remember that. And his guitar playing, everything about him was just fabulous, and he kind of ended up like Kevin, it's a very sad story, but he was on that night. I'm glad I got to see him in full possession of his powers, because they were awesome.
Yeah. And he's a huge influence on me too.
Absolutely.
And there's going to be some more Muscle Shoals connections here in just a minute.
Yeah.
But after quite a few years in Atlanta, and your son Trevor was born too
Right,
there.
7 years.
You moved up here
I did.
to Nashville, but even before, you met somebody who I guess at that point had moved to Nashville, and that's Dan Penn.
Yes.
So how did you get to meet him? Was that through Spooner?
It was. I came here for a meeting, I think a Cancer Society meeting, and I was here over the weekend, and my mother had just died, and my dad was up here for this meeting. So anyway, I came up, and I called Spooner from the hotel, and he came out to visit in the Maxwell house, as a matter of fact. And he came out to visit with me, and he said, what are you doing this weekend? Because the meeting was over. And I said, I'm not doing anything. So he said, why don't you come out to the house and hang out with me? And so he lived on Wallace Lane. So I came out and spent the evening with them, but he and Karen had kind of moved in there, and Roxanne was really a toddler at that point. And he took me by Dan's, and I met Dan for the first time, and we went out in his 35 Plymouth and laid a strip of rubber about 100 feet long and on a beer run.
And I know you and Dan not only connect through music, but connect
cars.
through your mutual love of cars.
Yeah. And Dan and I went on an 1,100-mile, almost 2,000-mile round trip to Minneapolis, Minnesota, to buy a 49 Ford for me, and then we towed it back behind Dan's pickup truck. So that was really the first time we spent a lot of time together. But the first song we wrote together was the opening song on my first record, King of Saturday Night. And then we started writing more and more. So I don't know, we've probably written over a dozen songs together, maybe more than that. But yeah, interested in cars and interested in just in R&B music. And Dan's obviously a great producer, and very, very fortunate that he's been involved with the 3 records that I've recorded.
Yeah, we'll talk about
Sure.
those 3 in just a minute. But you and Dan, you continued doing some drives to car shows and the like. But also, tell me a little bit about B3 organ you found for him.
I was in Knoxville when I was the president of the Arthritis Foundation in Tennessee. I went over with an attorney. We'd gone to a board meeting, and he said, would you mind if we just stopped off at this? I've got a client here, and her husband just died, and we're trying to sell her estate. So I said, great, So we went to this woman's house, and the first thing I saw when we went into her house was this beautiful B3 organ with a Leslie. Pristine condition, and I waited until they got their business done, and I said, wow, do you play the organ? And she said, no, my husband played it, but he's deceased. And she said, I didn't play it, I don't play it, and my kids aren't interested in it. I said, would you ever consider selling it? And she said, yeah, I'd sell it. And I said, well, what would you have to have for it, do you think? And she said, $3,000. And she pulled the seat up and showed me the original bill of sale from Norwalk, Connecticut. And I think the bill of sale was like $3,000, 1957. And I got back to Nashville, called Dan. I said, I have found an organ, pristine B3, in this lady's living room, and she's interested in selling it for $3,000. And he said, give me your number. So he and I and Carson Whitsitt, God bless him and rest him, got a trailer, hooked it up behind Dan's truck, or car, I guess, I don't remember, and drove to Knoxville like 2 days later or something, or the next weekend, and bought this organ. I think Dan bought it over the phone. And loaded it in the trailer and hossed it back to Dan's studio. And I think the only thing he had to do was reconstitute the plug, but otherwise it's awesome. It's amazing shape, and it's beautiful. So anyway, there's the B3 story.
Yeah, and you spent considerably more time in Dan's studio after that too. Around the turn of the century, you decided to record your first full-length album as an artist. How did you decide that you wanted to do that, or how did that come about?
Well, I was sitting in Dan's studio on his couch, and I helped Dan, Bucky Lindsay, and I helped Tom Gent build his studio. We put the ceiling in, let's put it that way. And I don't think my shoulder's ever been the same. But anyway, Dan and I were sitting there one day, and it was 2000, probably 1, and it just out of the blue, we were we'd written several songs together, and he said, you really deserve to make an album, Charlie. You're a good songwriter. And of course, coming from Dan Penn, that's the ultimate accolade. And I said, Dan, I'd love to do it, but Trevor's getting ready to go to college, and I don't know if I can. I don't think I can afford to do it. He said, don't worry about it. I'll give you the studio time. And I said, that's very generous, but I can't accept it. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my 49 Ford. So I traded a 49 Ford Coupe for studio time for my first record, and that's the way it got done, And then I obviously paid the musicians, but who were great. I mean, Carson and Spooner and Mike Leach from the Memphis Boys, and all these incredible.
You had a couple of really special guitar players on it too, with quite some history.
Yeah, Rick Vito and Mike
Durham.
Thank you.
And did Rick Vito play on that one too?
He did. He played slide guitar on 2 tracks.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and Ian Wallace was the drummer. He's a hell of a drummer. He drummed for Dylan and Don Henley, who's a drummer. So you figure that he got the best there is in Ian. God bless Ian. He's gone too, but he lives on through his recording. He played with King Crimson too. I mean, he's a hell of a drummer. But yeah, that came together quite quickly, actually. And it Stereophile magazine picked Once Upon a Time as one of the best 80 records released in 2003. So, and it got into the Grammy Awards guide. It didn't get nominated, but it was one of those small group of records that where the nominations came from. So, but I felt honored about that. And Dan is a great producer, and I had Jeff Gillette, who's one of the best engineers, who's worked for Sergio Mendes, and the names go on and on he's been associated with. He works with the Yellow Jackets currently, tours with them and does their live sound. But he cut his teeth on Stevie Wonder, the first record he ever did. He spent a year with him in the studio at Kendon in L.A. So he's worked with everybody, and I just saw him a couple of weeks ago. We went sailing together up in New Jersey. So that's that's how all that happened.
Came by Creative Workshop here a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. He told me that he beta tested some of those Fierce consoles.
Right, exactly.
Which was a funny little side note for me. But apparently, and that album came out in 2002, I believe.
It did.
It apparently must have whet your appetite, because you got to make another couple albums.
Right.
And For All I Am was the second one. I think it came
Correct.
out in 2007.
7 or 8. I think it was released in 8. Tell
me a little bit about that album.
King of let's see. That's Where Did Buddy Holly Go? That's a lot of people like that album a lot. It's kind of all over the place. Again, horns on several of the tracks. Great players. Bobby Emmons from the Memphis Boys stepped in with Spooner, and Mike Durham again, Mike Leach with the Memphis Boys.
Yeah, you pretty much reassembled the gang from
I did.
first album.
And Dan sings background on all my records, but the first record, I had Jimmy Griffin, too, from Bread. He and Dan sang all over that record, and I got to sing with Jimmy, actually, on a couple of cuts, and boy, what a thrill. I mean, Jimmy won an Oscar for the song For All We Know by the Carpenters. He wrote that, and he won an Academy Award. It was Song of the Year in 1970.
Yeah.
And a great vocalist. I mean, Bread. What can you say?
Yeah, and you mentioned a lot of people, really like that album. It's my favorite of yours too. Yeah. And it's hard to describe why, but I just love its laid back feel, and some is almost a little bit of a Jimmy Buffett territory. And
it's
Sea of Abaco.
Sea of Abaco, right? Thank you.
And I love Where Did Buddy Holly Go? I mean, that might be my favorite on that album.
At his 50th anniversary of his death, they played that all over the radio in Lubbock, and they played it in his museum in Lubbock. I sent it to them, and they said, "I guarantee you, we'll put it on full rotation." And so that was great.
I loved the line. I drove up through Clear Lake once. The speeding ticket
is all I got. Yeah, I remember the day that happened, February 3rd, 1959. I was standing outside of the cafeteria at Staples High School, and somebody came running up and said, "Have you heard the news?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens went down in a plane in Clear Lake, Iowa. They're dead." And it was just like, good Lord. And then you go home, and it's all the news for the next 2 or 3 days. That's all you saw, So huge impact. And I love Buddy Holly. So anyway, still resonates.
And shortly after you released that album is when we met. We met at Skirmerhorn when the Musicians Hall of Fame inducted the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section and the Crickets, and Margie Pomeroy, who was Ian Wallace's widow, is.
Yeah. That's right.
Introduced us, and
wow.
So, that's when our, story started. That was way before I moved here, but we stayed in touch and eventually started collaborating on songs too.
Yeah, exactly.
And about 3 or 4 years ago, you decided to cut the third album.
Right. 2013, I guess we cut it.
Which I was fortunate to play a very small part in.
You played a huge part in it because we got stuck at the end of the record, and you're the one that saved our bacon. You got online and figured out how to download whatever it was that allowed us to actually literally finish the record. So it was no small part that you played in that, and I acknowledge that much on the album sleeve. So
and I remember, it was really fun to be part of your creative process on deciding which songs to record and so forth.
Right.
And obviously, fly on the wall in the studio too.
Good.
And got to spend more time with Dan, which was
right.
Since I love him mainly as an artist and writer.
Yeah.
But get to see that side too. And but anyway, what made you want to do a third album?
I had the songs, and it's probably what'll make me do a fourth album.
I hope so.
Yeah, because we've written some good ones. I'd love, to get together with Dan and write some more, and you and I can continue to write. And I wrote 3 or 4 with Spooner last time too. So I think it's just a function of, as you get near something like that, you kind of, I think when you get to be almost 74 years old, you realize time is more and more valuable, and you're running out of it So you want to leave behind as much as you can, as long as it's great, it's good stuff. So, and we, when we get together, between Dan, Jeff, they don't let things slide. If they don't like it, then you do it over and over and over until you get it right. So, but fortunately, the people I've had playing on the tracks are so good that they don't have to do it over. I may have to do it over and over on my vocals, but they don't have to do it. So they're great musicians.
You had Mike Durham come back to play guitar. You had Steve Mackey on bass, Kenny Malone on drums.
Right.
And Spooner and Bobby Ammons playing the keys.
Yeah.
Buzz Cason came in and sang a little bit. So did Dan.
Yep.
You had the Muscle Shoals horns on a few tracks.
Man. It's Charles Rose and company, Steve Herman.
And
Mr. Moffat,
yeah,
all great, and great feel too. I mean, Charles Rose is a hell of an arranger, so, and obviously a stellar player. He's on the road with Lyle Lovett as we speak, so down in hurricane territory. I hope they make it out of there okay.
Yeah, and along the way, some of those more recent song of yours were also recorded by other artists. Chuck Carbo did one of the songs
Chuck
that you and Dan.
I'd rather beg than steal. Yeah, he did that. That's how Dan helped me get a publishing company started on that song. So, and then Mitch Mann cut a song you and I wrote.
Ours, which was, and I'm almost a little embarrassed to admit this here in front of you, but I really tried to push him to, get as many original songs on it, and me, the producer, kind of prevented me from pitching him my songs because I felt like that's a different hat,
Of course.
But at the same time, he knew I had this song, and we performed it once together with me singing, and he's like, we were in pre-production. He's like, I want to cut this song of yours, and he's like. I'm like, well, you got songs. And I said, no, I want to cut this song. So I have to give him credit for actually making it on the album. And now whenever we do band shows with him, we close our set with the songs because it's just a single. People just love the good.
Yeah, I love it. I'd like to cut it too. It's like, it's a special song. And there's some other things we've written I like to do too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so anyway, here we are.
Yep.
And I'm pretty much try to cover whatever I felt was, important in the life of Charlie Taylor in and around music. Is there anything you feel we need to add to what we were able to talk about?
I really can't think of anything else. I just want to say our friendship means a lot to me, and it's going on probably 8 or 10 years at least.
We met 9 years ago this fall.
Okay, so that's and we're business partners in a sense too. So that just says everything.
Yeah,
with regard to
we got to release your music in Japan, which is fun too.
Through Crazy Chester, which is even more fun, and so and you've helped me archive songs and dug up stuff I'd totally forgotten about, which I appreciate, and some legacy to leave my children, and so I just appreciate our friendship, and it means a lot to me. I don't have a lot of good friends, but I certainly count you as one of my best friends.
Well, thank you, and that is absolutely mutual. And thank you very much for spending this, hour with me here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Studio.
It's been fun.
So, and I look forward to all our future endeavors.
I look forward to it. Take care.
You too. Thank you, Charlie.
You bet.
This was the 11th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We taped it at Buzz Cason's legendary Creative Workshop recording studio in the Berry Hill neighborhood of Nashville. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you next week.